Ladies and gentlemen, this is Remzi Sanver from CNRS, the French National Scientific Research Center, and also a member of the Grand Lodge of Turkey. I extend to each of you a most cordial welcome to this meeting of OpenLFM. And it is an immense joy and honor to introduce a distinguished intellectual, a brilliant researcher, and a very close brother and friend, Yavuz Agaoglu, to whom we will have the pleasure to listen today. Yavuz is a very important figure of research into Freemasonry. His contributions are threefold, at least threefold. First, and I say this with no exaggeration, a considerable part of what we know about the history of Freemasonry in Turkey is due to Yavuz. He is a prolific writer. He published over 20 books and countless papers with an impressive diversity of historical topics, including the evolution of the Turkish ritual, the foundation of the Ottoman Grand East, the sleep period during the Second World War, the big schism in Turkish Freemasonry in the 1960s. In fact, he wrote about almost all periods and every important topic of Turkish Freemasonry. He has also done work on interesting microanalyses, such as the evolution of the used music in Turkish lodges, just as an example. This may be a good point to note that I had the privilege of being his co-author in 2 books and several papers, which has been a truly mind-opening experience. Second, I follow Freemasonry in Turkey since at least 30 years, and I can safely tell that the tradition of talking about Turkish Freemasonry with references to secondary sources was quite dominant. Obviously, this is no good, and I think now this culture is changing. The new generation of Turkish intellectuals, they seem to have understood the importance of research from archives and primary sources, and Yavuz is among the handful of people who ensured this transition. Last, but certainly not the least, he has been a source of inspiration to many other researchers, including myself, but most importantly to younger generations. As a modest researcher, but also a member of the Grand Lodge of Turkey, I am delighted to see this new generation of bright researchers, almost all inspired by the work of Yavuz. One thing I regret is that the published work of Yavuz has been mostly in Turkish, so his contributions are not that much known in international platforms. I hope his presentation today at OpenLFM would further motivate him to share his knowledge with the rest of the world. Dear Yavuz, my brother, thank you very much for all what you have contributed to us, including your talk today, which I'm sure will be very interesting. So the floor is yours to talk about the Ottoman Grand East by the fall of the Ottoman Empire. You have 45 minutes, not sharp, you can extend it slightly. And this will be followed by my short discussion, and then we will leave the floor to the comments and questions from the audience. I hope we will complete all the session in 90 minutes at most. Yavuz, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Remzi, for your kind introduction. It's an honor for a modest researcher to be introduced by a world-class academic like you. It's also a privilege for me to address the distinguished guests of Open Lectures on Freemasonry tonight. So I'm gonna try to share my screen. And I will ask the host to let me share. Okay.
Please go ahead.
Okay. Okay, tonight I will try to take you to a journey through the times of Ottoman Grand East by the fall of the empire. And I will take this journey to you by the recently revealed minutes of the meetings of the Grand Lodge officers of Ottoman Grand East. So tonight we're going to take this journey through the first degree archive materials. But for the ones who are not close to the subject, I would like to make a short introduction tonight with this plan. So our first question is why the fall of the Ottoman Empire is important, and what is the importance of Ottoman Freemasonry? And I will try to give a brief information about the Ottoman Grand East, and I will try to comment on the difficulties relating to accurate archive material on the Ottoman Grand East. So first, let's start with the question of why the fall of the Ottoman Empire is important. As most of you know, Ottoman Empire was one of the most significant role players in the history of Eastern Europe, Western Asia, Middle East, and Mediterranean territory in almost every aspect. Lasted more than 600 years and gradually declining and finally falling of the empire had tremendous and also controversial consequences. Let me give you one example. There are 45 nations in this territory now. As the influential areas included, this number raises to 75 nations today. So this fact, the fall of the Ottoman Empire, is important for the history of all these nations. What is the importance of Ottoman Freemasonry? Well, Ottoman Freemasonry is perhaps one of the outstanding examples in terms of the historical interaction of different Masonic traditions. However, in order to understand this interaction, it's necessary to mention the multicultural, multi-religious, multilingual, and colorful social life in this wide geography. It is most commonly said that it's where the East and the West flow into each other through culture and trade. So Freemasonry reached to the rich Ottoman ports through Western traders and diplomats. Even though the history of Freemasonry in Ottoman Empire dates back to the first half of the 18th century, that early, it went on in several phases. First, as you see, the colonial period, where no locals were allowed in the lodge. Then the cosmopolitan opposition period, where the Ottoman elites, first the Christians and Jews, and then the Muslim intellectuals, elites, bureaucrats, soldiers, and officers were introduced. Freemasonry, meeting with local intellectuals with Westernization ideas, had an important result of Freemasonry, meeting with politic opposition against the absolute monarchy regime. Westernization ideas towards the parliamentary monarchy finally reached the success in 1908, and an important outcome of this success, a sort of crowning this success, was Ottoman Grand East. I have to admit that Ottoman Grand East to me is just like an Ottoman city, multicultural, multilingual, colorful, but always sitting in the sharp edge of conflicts. So now I will give a brief information about the establishment of the Ottoman Grand East in 1909. Founders of Ottoman Grand East, first. But let me tell you, foundation of Ottoman Grand East in the place where all different Grand Lodges were operating with their lodges in the Ottoman territory. And there was sort of a competition going on. So in 1909, we observed two initiatives for the foundation of Ottoman Grand East. The first one by Urfi Pasha, which failed, and later by Prince Aziz Hasan Pasha, which succeeded. And the founders of the Ottoman Grand East, we observed that it reflects the multicultural structure of institution. There were Christians, Jews, and Muslims from different ethnic origin. For instance, half of the founders and half of the first grand officers elected were non-Muslims. Well, founders and the group of members of Ottoman Grand East were from different obediences, meaning from different Masonic cultures and traditions. So the Ottoman rituals, which were brought to light in recent years, showed us that they were unique, consciously designed to fulfill the needs of members from different cultures. A synthesis aiming to bring Masons from different Masonic traditions under the same roof. And constitution and regulations were also specially designed by the founders. Well, the foundation of Ottoman Grand East, a National Grand Lodge of Ottoman Empire, indicating to us as a politic project of Union and Progress Party, means the joint politic opposition which succeeded in 1908 revolution. So the constitution of Ottoman Grand East was designed as being the only sovereign Masonic power in Ottoman territory. And I would like to give an interesting example from this constitution. The 6th article. The goal of the Grand Lodge, which was mentioned in this article, saying establishing new lodges in Syria, Iraq, Tripoli, and in other territories. Well, this was expeditiously accomplished, and new lodges upon the Ottoman Grand East were established rapidly. Also in significant zones of influence, as well as Syria, Egypt, Lebanon. And soon after the establishment, we observed the Grand Lodge began to weaken the influence of foreign obediences on Ottoman territories. So I think this might finally have an idea for European Grand Lodges that Ottoman Freemasonry is changing dramatically in the course of time. Well, the main characteristics of Ottoman Grand East seems to be close to the continental Masonic culture, which means continental Masonic culture, searching for the truth, seeking the meaning of life with esoteric approach. And now I would like to remind you the last OpenLFM lecture in May by Thierry Zarkon and Remzi Samver, focusing about the relations between the roots of Islamic Sufi esoteric tradition with Freemasonry. So as we analyze the rituals and constitution and regulations of Ottoman Grand East, we notice a conscious design, as we may interpret as a secular spirituality. Well, consequently, this can be described as a unique call for all Ottoman intellectuals from various religions. Well, when it comes to put to the practice, every theory evolves into different directions. So did Ottoman Grand East. A gradual root change in Ottoman Grand East can be observed as a regional conflicts, the rise of nationalism, polarization, wars, and finally, disintegration in joint opposition in politics in Ottoman world. This had an outcome for Ottoman Grand East. And now, end of this introduction, I would like to mention about the difficulties relating the accurate archive material on the Ottoman Grand East. There is very limited archive material revealed on Ottoman Grand East. Unfortunately, this exciting story of Ottoman Grand is partially, or I would say perhaps mostly, covered with rumors, tales, legends, and conspiracy theories. Taking into consideration of very limited number of archive materials, one can say that the Ottoman Grand East is still like an undiscovered continent and an open field for further studies. Therefore, the recently found minutes of the meetings of the Grand Lodge officers covering the era of 1917 and 1920 and 1920 to 1924 has an exceptional importance for the researchers. I feel privileged to work on this precious archival material and translate, and publish the first part a couple of years ago. And the next volume will be published before the end of this year, I presume. I would like to remind you that there is no earlier group of documents about administration of Ottoman Grand East before that date. So let's take the first steps onto this undiscovered continent of history and have a general view on the Ottoman Grand East by the fall of the empire. Now I will try to share a general view of Ottoman Grand East by the fall of the empire with this plan. First, let's start with the member profile. As far as the profiles of the members of Ottoman Grand East, two striking observations can be made. Even though the political turbulences and polarizations caused by the regional wars, still the multicultural structure, multi-religious structure was preserved. This is something to be noted. Since the lodge activities were terminated by the government from time to time, and also Ottoman Freemasonry is being in extremely complicated situation. Even the Grand Master is martyrized in Caucasus campaign. Plus, 1915 Armenian incidents should also be separately approached within this context. It is not difficult to speculate that 1915 incidents had significant influences on the Ottoman intellectuals and also the provincial lodges in the country. As we examine the minutes, we clearly see the initiations from different ethnic origins, from different classes of society. And this structure I'm mentioning is also observed in the board, in the Grand Officers Board as well. This is also worth to be noted and new to us. Well, who were the new members in the post-war era? Detailed minutes of meetings of Grand Officers show that new members were from state bureaucrats to school teachers, from army officers to private sector managers and clerks, from doctors to lawyers, from post office workers to university students. And surprisingly, even from the two separate or competitive or rivalry, I would say, governments of late Ottomans, which means bureaucrats from Istanbul government and some representatives from National Assembly in Ankara were members. This surely is a colorful picture. Another striking thing is one may also find surprising that the public interest was still existing even by the fall of the empire. We have to keep in mind that the life in Ottoman Empire after the Great War was difficult. Shortages of food, rations, curfews, security and transportation problems, and everything. And surprisingly, we noticed in the minutes that even under those conditions, the minutes frequently mention about the positive interest in the society for the Freemasonry. In the minutes, it's also emphasized that the candidates should also be specifically investigated by moral, spiritual, and mental means, in addition to current constitution and regulations, in order to evaluate the increasing number of applications to the Freemasonry. This is striking. It is also worth to note that in accordance with this purpose, investigation documents and new petition forms were prepared and redesigned in that period. And the Freemasons from the Ottoman Grand East laid emphasis on the procedures to determine how to negotiate about the candidates in the lodge. And also, we observed in the minute that the sensitivity displayed for the applicants regarding to religion is an important issue. We see that in this context, warnings given to lodges not to propose the topics concerning the religion for the agenda, and warnings given in reference to prevent the applicants who do not belong to any religion to be accepted. This is interesting. And how about the lodges working under Ottoman Grand East? I mentioned the rapid growth in the Ottoman Grand East in the early years. 29 lodges were founded in the first 3 years, but through the end of the Great War, Ottoman Grand East had lost 17 lodges, which were left outside the territories of the empire. In addition to this, 3 lodges in the eastern Anatolia provinces of Ottoman Grand East were unable to work and closed due to losing its members. And 1 lodge in the city of Izmir went to the dormancy period, or went to exile because of the Greek occupation, and moved to Istanbul, which caused serious complications in Ottoman Grand East bureaucracy later. So only the lodges in Istanbul was able to operate. In 1920, there were only 9 lodges left and approximately 300 active members. And we also find statements about active members in 1923, around 500. It can only be said that the administrative problems occur during that time in Ottoman Freemasonry. For instance, the grand officers, we observed, did not conduct any meeting between March 4, 1918 and May 4, 1918. So there is no minute in those 2 months. And interestingly, meeting number 110 is missing, along with a torn page, which was never mentioned afterwards. Besides this gap of 2 months gap, the relations with lodges in Ottoman Grand East was carefully noted. Information about the candidates, initiation, passing and raising ceremonies, affiliations from other obediences, demands for certificate of degrees, correspondences, and discussions about daily routines, they are all in the minutes. Within this general view, I would like to mention about the Aleppo Lodge very shortly, because the communications were locked down and the lodge was not able to communicate with Istanbul under the war conditions. It demanded to be tolerated about the procedures about the registry by the lodge, and Aleppo Lodge, as you know, was one of the lodges left outside of Ottoman territory. So there were those kind of problems as well. But besides that, we have the number of active members in Ottoman Grand East, which I mentioned, and number of initiations mentioned in the report of the Grand Officers meeting of report between 1921 and 1924, and there were 518 new members. I'm not saying they were all active, but new members, initiations in those years. What about the foreign relations? Let's start with the lodges working under different Grand Lodges or Orients. There were lodges in Istanbul and Izmir working under different Grand Lodges or different Grand Orients, like Greek, French, and Italian lodges. They were established before the foundation of Ottoman Grand East. I think this is what we can describe as a foreign lodge working in other obediences territory with permission. Let us say that it's sort of privilege, a capitulation. We observe the growing discomfort from the Ottoman Grand East side, especially in the years of 1921 and 1922, where the independence war was going on in Anatolia. This was an incident, to be said, not written in the minute only, also defended in the international platforms by Ottoman Grand East. So let me give you a couple examples about foreign relations with the lodges working under the other Grand Lodges. One case of Armenia Lodge operating under the Greek obedience in this period should be specifically emphasized. In 1919, the Armenia Lodge, which was not able to contact with its own obedience due to the rupture of relations between those two countries, asked Ottoman Grand East permission in order to continue its operation under these conditions. Even, I'm quoting right now, handed over its member to the patronage of the Ottoman Grand East. But circumstances changed later on. As the Renaissance and Armenia lodges had sent complaint letters to European Grand Lodges in 1922 about the political climate in the fall of the empire, this caused a long-term Masonic conflict in Istanbul. Powerful reactions from Ottoman Grand East lodges were mentioned. But on the other hand, even in this highly distressed subject, we come across a special meeting between two sides, which was carefully noted in the minutes as mutual positive understanding, and I'm quoting, brotherly. Just to remind you, years later, by the agreement signed between obediences, Armenia Lodge was agreed to start working under Turkish Grand East in 1937, but it didn't happen since the Turkish Freemasonry went to the dormancy period in 1935. But the other lodge, Renaissance Lodge, started to work under Turkish Grand East at the very beginning of 1935. So this is interesting. Moreover, also in 1919, it was another incident that Italia Risorta Lodge from Italian obedience demanded to work within the same building with the Ottoman lodges. We observed that starting from the mentioned time in 1919, different lodges started to use the same building to meet. Well, afterwards, this caused a serious problem later on in 1921 by Italian Risorta Lodge members who were in charge of commission handling the Masonic facilities, who closed the doors to some Ottoman Grand East lodges due to the missed shared rental payments. So this was the event that Ottoman Grand East office and lodges working under Ottoman Grand East moved to a different location with all its facilities. Let me remind you that Italia Risorta was home of many Ottoman elites. Even once Grand Master, later Sovereign Grand Commander of Ottoman Supreme Council between 1912 and 1926, Mehmet Ali Baba. Perhaps the most powerful Freemason in his time in Ottoman Masonic world was initiated in 1872 in this lodge. Another interesting example is La Turquie Lodge of the Grand Lodge of Scotland, who could not carry on its own Masonic activities in Istanbul after commencement of the First World War. The minutes show that the private lodge building of La Turquie Lodge were occupied by the previous government, and these buildings and lodge building were allocated to Venereal Diseases Hospital. And we find out in the minutes that the furniture of the lodge was set to be removed to a warehouse and its famous library to the museum. There were meetings held between both sides and no satisfactory answers. I have to add that as we search, we find out that the provincial director of medical department of Istanbul and responsible director of local security forces at that time were also famous Ottoman Freemasons. Well, despite all these efforts mentioned in the minutes, the issue was not completely enlightened. And last example, very interesting example. As it can be remembered, another Italian-oriented lodge, Byzantia Risorta Lodge, which partook in the foundation of Ottoman Grand East and joined Ottoman Grand East. Important figures of Ottoman Grand East and Supreme Council, they were initiated in this lodge and affiliated to other Ottoman lodges afterwards. But a serious incident we come across in the minutes, in 1922, as the Byzantia Risorta Lodge decided to break relations with Ottoman Grand East due to the discriminative attitude by the other members of Ottoman lodges, and decided to join back Italian Grand Order. Well, of course, this interesting act by the experienced Masons, as we track the minutes of Grand Officers, we observe the maneuver of Masonic diplomatic relations between two obediences, and finally, the problem solved by explanation of misunderstandings. And Byzantia Risorta Lodge joined Ottoman Grand East again with normal procedure and ceremonies, but with the same lodge number afterwards. Let me remind you, in 1925, the lodge had changed its name as Acacia. Well, as far as the relations with other obediences, I would like to mention 5 important cornerstones for the Ottoman Grand East. Before the end of the Great War, we observed correspondences with Chile, Argentina, and Hungary, and mutual grand representatives were declared with the German Grand Lodges of Hamburg and Prussia, American Masonic Federation, Mexico, and Bulgaria. Let me find it. Okay. So, one event to be emphasized is the Masonic Convention, which was held in Berlin in 1918, between July 19 and 22, with participation of Grand Lodges of Central Powers of the First World War. The delegations of Germany, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Ottoman Empire were together. We understand that It was Grand Master of Ottoman Grand East, also Minister of Finance, Cavit Bey's idea to gather the Central Power Grand Lodges. And time and place was chosen specially for his travel plans, and his agenda was, but clearly he had chosen to stay in Carlsbad instead because of his political and economic contacts. Those contacts in Carlsbad include Mustafa Kemal, who would soon be the leader of Turkish independence war. Of course, it's an important event to focus on, especially the political reflections of it, and also the storm it created in Ottoman Grand East in the armistice period. I will not go on details because of the time, but I would like to remind you that me and three colleagues of mine, Reinhard Martner, Lajlo Veri, and Ozan Aslan, along with co-editor Okan Yunusoğlu, had published a joint book on this convention 2 years ago. It also includes a detailed report of the meetings. Well, starting with 1920 and especially 1921, we observe a great expansion of correspondence with foreign obediences. The foundation of Internal Masonic Association in Geneva in 1921 is an important event. Ottoman Grand East was one of the Grand Lodges to be asked to join. There is much information about this event. I will not go in details right now, but I would like to mention a few highlights about it. This meeting, Ottoman Grand East presented by Muslihiddin Adil with the clear approval of Ottoman government. First, we find in the minutes, it was asked to Cavit Bey, who was already in Europe at that time, but he refused due to his tight schedule. But this is interesting because by that time, the Ottoman administration had changed. Politics in the empire was already going in different directions, and Cavit Bey was facing several accusations. Musliddin Adil Bey, on the other hand, was a fellow craft at that time, and it was decided that raise him to a master's degree immediately. Musliddin Adil, who attended that meeting, was a well-known scholar, also a member of Committee of Cooperation with the League of Nations, which was also founded by the Ottoman government, this committee I'm mentioning. And besides Musliddin Adil, there was also a very famous Mason, later Grand Master of Ottoman Grand East, Ömer Besim Pasha. This is really an interesting subject to track on. There are other meetings as well, but let's keep on. Actually, the first contact about AMI was seen in 1919 in the minutes as Bureau International de Relations Maçonniques, which Ottoman Grand East was already a member, especially the correspondence with general manager of this organization, Monsieur Cartier-Latin, is important. He is the one who would become a grand secretary later when AMI was founded. I mentioned his name especially because after the foundation of AMI, we observed that Cartier-Latin was seen as a consultant by Ottoman Grand East on the subject of Masonic regularity. In the report of Grand Officers of Ottoman Grand East, it is stated that before the declaration of exchanging grand representatives with any obedience, advice of Brother Cartier-Latin was always to be considered. Well, about the mutual representatives in 1912, we have a list from the minute book. The list of obediences which complete the procedure of declaration of mutual grand representatives. And the names that I will mention, procedure is completed with those Grand Orients or Grand Lodges. Grand Orient Lusitanian, Portuguese Grand Orient, Grand Orient de Belgique, Netherlands, Brazil, Grand Lodge Alpino of Switzerland, Grand Lodge of Bulgaria, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Hungary, Egypt, New York, and also a Catalan Grand Lodge, Grand Lodge Balearic Regional Catalano. As you may notice, this list doesn't include German lodges. There are missing information in this list, to be exact, like the great representative for Grand Orient de France was David Cohen, who was very experienced, very well-known Freemason. Besides the list, correspondences in early 1920s with Grand Lodge de France, Grand Orient d'Italie, Grand Lodge d'Italie, Grand Orient of Spain later, Chile, Costa Rica, Colombia. Very colorful picture. But there is a special note at the end of the list that I'm sharing right now, that Grandmaster and Deputy Grandmaster, if the term is right for that time, are reserved as for the future connection with United Grand Lodge of England and Grand Lodge of Scotland. Well, as the time goes quickly, I will go very brief on this very important issue, politics of Ottoman Grand East. As you know, as the change of the Ottoman government, the armistice period, at the same time, similarly, the administration of Ottoman Grand East has changed by the intervention of Grand Commander Mehmet Ali Baba. And because of his notes to grand officers who didn't meet in 2 months, they had to resign, and a re-election in the board of Ottoman Grand East come, and Rıza Tevfik Bey, opponent of Talat Pasha or Union and Progress Party, has become in power. So it was time when the legal proceedings and trials on accused Ottoman war criminals were on the agenda by the Allied forces. And it was also interested by the Ottoman Freemasons. So to clear their names for the Ottoman Grand East, they decided to move very sharply project, and they changed the temporary article in regulations, and they prepared 2 lists of important Freemasons at that time, politically, who might have been found guilty by the Allied forces. So the list contained very important names, and they another list they prepared. So 33 Masons from different ethnic origin, from different sides of political attitude, they were listed, and they were to be expelled. But everything had changed after the occupation of Izmir in May 15, and the reaction and uprising in the Ottoman society changed the Ottoman Freemasonry as well. So we faced another intervention by Grand Commander Mehmet Ali Baba, and new arrangement on the proceedings of the announced lists, as saying that no judgment can be made by the absence of accused ones. And the list carried today with a rumor, a legend, that they were expelled by Rıza Tevfik. Actually, what really happened to the list? We have the answer. They were on the board. They were elected grand officers right after 1 term, 2 terms. Cavit Bey was signed for duties by the Ankara government, also by the Ottoman Grand East. Anyhow, another route change, a new balance, and a new Grand Master was elected. He was a propaganda commission. He had declarations by the new administration, and Supreme Council was always in the way, especially by the election of Besim Ömer, the Grand Master. Some of the delegates in the Grand Assembly had protest against the result of Grand Master election. And so they wrote a petition of protest against the results, not just to Ottoman Grand East, but Supreme Council. And Supreme Council did not reject it. And so Supreme Council started a procedure, and there were many declarations on both sides. They published their arguments of explanations about why this election was legal, why not. And in this post-war era, it ended, let's say, brotherly, as the Supreme Council accepted the election as legal, and Ottoman Grand East accepted and obeyed the greater power of the Supreme Council, not just the founding power. Also, I'm quoting, the reason of Masonic life. So I'm coming to the end by the charity works and other activities. As you may know, the Besim Ömer Pasha is a very famous person as far as the NGOs concerned, former general manager of Red Crescent organization, and also playing important role for society for the protection of children were there. So I will have to skip this part, but let's ask the question: what happened to the Ottoman Grand East after all? In just 6 days before the last Sultan of Ottoman Empire left or escaped, whatever you may prefer, to the country, a resolution was already presented in the Grand Officers meeting, as you are seeing right now, to change the name from Ottoman Grand East to the Turkish Grand East at November 11, 1922. So Ottoman Grand East was soon a history or a story in the world of Freemasonry, but leaving his traces and marks into the future generations, with all those stories and interesting journeys. Now we definitely have new questions, and a perception exercise is waiting for me and for all the researchers. Thank you very much. So thank you. That's all.
Dear Yavuz, in fact, it is us who thanks you for your very interesting findings and analysis regarding the foundation of the Ottoman Grand East, and of course for this brilliant presentation. You conclude by leaving an open question, the traces of the founding culture of the Ottoman Grand East to the continuation, which is the Grand Lodge of Turkey. And in fact, I will take from there, and my short and much less brilliant discussion will make an observation on the very visible transmission of the founding culture of the Ottoman Grand East to future generation in Turkish Freemasonry. As a matter of fact, one may claim that this is not very surprising for an institution of tradition such as Freemasonry. However, I still find interesting to remark that several, if not all, the cultural elements raised today by Yavuz form a leitmotif in the century-long historiography of the Grand Lodge of Turkey. It is also worth emphasizing that the Ottoman Grand East was not a regular Grand Lodge. The regularization of the Grand Lodge of Turkey occurred at the end of 50s, early 60s. By the way, this is a story that is very interesting on its own. But in spite of this change, in spite of this quite radical change of Masonic principles, the cultural elements of the foundation prevailed. Well, I will pick two of the points raised by Yavuz. One is the relationship between the Supreme Council, the Scottish Rite, and the Grand Lodge. As he said, the Ottoman Grand East was dependent to its Supreme Council, which made the Scottish Rite the only rite in the country. Of course, this dependency was questioned by the Grand Lodge, and there was a continuous tension between the Grand Lodge and the Supreme Council, which ended up in a breakup in the 1960s, when the Grand Lodge got its independence from the Supreme Council and became regular. This is also the moment where a schism occurred in Turkey, in Freemasonry in Turkey. And Freemasonry in Turkey started to be practiced in two different blocks, regular and liberal ones. For the rest of my discussion, I refer to regular Freemasonry in Turkey. The relationship between the Grand Lodge and the Supreme Council was bitter for many years, even after the independence, until early 2000, I would say. Moreover, the Grand Lodge in Turkey, even after the independence, inherited the top-to-down management culture of the Supreme Council, and its relations with its constituent lodges were quite abnormal until even 2010. Today, the Grand Lodge of Turkey no more uses Scottish Rite rituals, but Scottish Rite is the only rite for higher degrees. And when you say rite, most of the brothers of the Grand Lodge of Turkey would recall only the Scottish Rite. In brief, the Masonic culture of the Scottish Rite is still dominant within regular Turkish Freemasonry, much more for liberal ones, and one can trace back the present situation to the foundation of the Ottoman Grand East. The other point I will pick is the relationship between Freemasonry and politics. Freemasonry in the Ottoman Empire was born as a movement of enlightenment, and it was explicitly political. This character, this political character, was not restricted to the foundation period. As Yavuz mentioned several times, there was a very visible relationship between Freemasonry and Turkish politics, and this was until mid-1960s. I will not get into the details here, but every era of Turkish politics had its reflections on the Grand Lodge of Turkey. As no politics is a principle of regular Freemasonry, the situation changed after 1960s with the regularization of the Grand Lodge of Turkey. Since 1960s, the Grand Lodge of Turkey cut its institutional links with politics, while at an individual level, one could frequently observe the enthusiasm of brothers to change the country through Freemasonry. As a matter of fact, regarding the relationship between Freemasonry and politics, the prevailing culture within the Grand Lodge of Turkey is much closer, for example, to Latin America than England. Again, this culture can be traced back to the foundation of the Ottoman Grand East. Well, I could make similar claims on several other elements of Yavuz's talk, but I will stop here because while speaking to a community, this is a community which needs not to be convinced that understanding the present necessitates to knowing the past. So I'm truly stopping here and leaving the floor to participants. Well, you may ask your questions through the chat, but I think it's also possible that you can raise hands, ladies and gentlemen, and I can give the word orally. Yes, the floor is open for comments, questions, and critiques.
Good evening. Uh, Here is Shai from Herzliya. Here, um, thank you for such a nice talk, very enlightening. My question is about one group. You mentioned a couple of groups in your talk, but I wanted to ask about one group specific, which is the Dönme. Were there Dönme in the Ottoman Freemasonry, and if so, what was the role, or did they take a center stage in the Ottoman Freemasonry?
Thanks, Brother Shai. By the way, Brother Shai is the worshipful master of a research lodge in the Grand Lodge of the State of Israel. Welcome, Brother Shai. Brother Yavuz, do you have any comments or answer to this question?
Actually, I didn't understand the question.
Brother Shai, could you ask once again?
What group of Freemasons?
Which group you meant? You should unmute yourself, Shai.
The Dönme. Dönme.
Dönme?
Dönme.
Oh, dönme. Dönme. Okay.
Well, this is a fascinating subject to talk about. We can talk till tomorrow, but it's full of rumors, legends, stories, mostly covered, and to find the truth between them is very hard. But
by the way, Yavuz, excuse me for the interruption, but maybe you can make a very short introduction to what dönme is, because probably not everyone comes from our region, and they may not be acquainted with the concept.
Dönme means, especially it is mentioned for the Jew society in Thessaloniki, in Greece, once was in Ottoman Empire's territory, who turned their religion to Muslim. So they were Muslims, actually, but dönme means changing the relations, the religions, actually. So powerful people from rich society members, from intellectuals who had the power in Istanbul, had controlled the Ottoman government, and Ottoman Freemasonry was the rumor. Where do we know this rumor? To answer this question, perhaps we have to go back to the 1908, the foundation of Ottoman Grand East, where the English approach of Freemasonry was left out, and the result was quite tragic, because a secret report was published, I'm quoting, by the British Embassy, saying that those dönmes were in power of Ottoman Empire, also in Ottoman Grand East. So they were handling everything in the country. So the conspiracy theory of a country is run by the people with the secret beliefs, with secret relations, with secret religions, were always in agenda up to now. So it's a long story, but very fascinating and enjoy to read. But as far as the accurate archive material, as a researcher, I have to say almost nothing.
Thanks, Brother Shai. Shalom. So I received two questions from the chat, and I see Brother Ozan Arslan raising his hand. So I will first ask one of the questions from the chat. Mr. Or brother, perhaps, sorry, Guy Lasern asks, what are the foreign connections with Turkish Freemasonry influencing it? I suppose this is related to the foundation of the Ottoman Grand East, not for Turkish Freemasonry today. If I'm wrong, please unmute yourself, Brother Guy. The question is about the foreign connections of Turkish Freemasonry influencing it, I suppose, at the time. Yavuz, do you have any comment on this?
A very short comment, perhaps. As far as I know, from the archive material, we observed that there was a competition going on in the foundation of Ottoman Grand East. There were many obediences included in this competition from the English side, of course, British side, I would rather say, and also the French side, the continental Freemasonry part. There were French or Italian and Belgian Freemasons who were in the operation or in the work of founding the Ottoman Grand East, but also Egyptian Freemasonry was in the topic. So the continental Masonic culture interacted and influenced the Ottomans, but also English Freemasonry through the English, British lodges, English or Scottish lodges in the Ottoman territory, or through the way of Egyptian Freemasonry, had influences, as we follow from the archive material. But of course, I have to end this sentence with, don't you forget that we are stepping in the undiscovered continent.
Thank you, Yavuz. And the question is coming from a distinguished historian. Dear Ozan, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Actually, it's a very short comment. First of all, I mean, talking and debating, discussing about the history of the Ottoman Grand East is always fascinating, but it is also fascinating to listen to Yavuz Selim Agaoglu. So I was just thinking about this probable Crimean War origins of the birth of the Ottoman Grand East. Maybe we can even call it the Crimean War spirit, because it really had a major effect, because the origins of the Ottoman Grand East goes back to the lodges founded in the 1850s, 60s and 70s, following the end of the Crimean War, because it was basically an institutional alliance between the Ottoman Empire on one side and the Western powers of Britain and France on the other. And of course, the visibility and the growing presence of Western diplomats, military personnel, high-ranking officers in the Ottoman cities, and of course, combined with the impact of the Industrial Revolution, I believe were really instrumental in the birth of the Ottoman Grand East as the origins of it, because the zeitgeist in the balance of power among the great powers of the age actually required more committed policies and endeavors of Britain, and to some extent, those of France, to encourage, to support, and even to mentor the structural and comprehensive Western-style reform programs in the Ottoman Empire. So Tanzimat and later Islahat reforms. So the involvement, the engagement of Britain and France in the Near East included even the preservation of the Ottoman Empire, its protection from Russian intervention and expansionism, at least for several decades of the 19th century. So there was this eventual marginalization of Mehmed Ali Pasha of Egypt, the London Straits Convention, and of course, while culminating in the support of Britain and France to the survival of and to the westernization of the Ottoman Empire in the Crimean War. So this, we can say, I believe, the same zeitgeist required also the admission of the Ottoman Empire into the family of Western nations and into the concert of Europe, quote unquote, as it was called at that time. So kind of proto-European Union, even we can say, and of course, as well as a growing presence of Western diplomats and military, because again, in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, in Istanbul, in Izmir, we can easily observe the foundation of many, many lodges by the British, French, Italian Grand Easts. And also, I just mentioned Tanzimat and Islat. At least on the paper, actually, we can say that the Imperial Edict of Reform theoretically granted full equality to the peoples of the empire, regardless of creed. And I believe this is no coincidence that the enrichment, in a way, of the Masonic valleys in the cosmopolitan cities of the Ottoman Empire, open to the West, was at that time. And of course, politically, because we can never ignore actually the impact of international politics in the history of Freemasonry. So both France and Britain at that time saw the Ottoman Empire as a weak but useful political actor and an important economic and commercial partner in the East, in the Orient, and finally eager to reform itself, at least to some extent, under Western mentorship. So I would like to hear actually maybe some comments of Yavuz Selim Agaoglu on this maybe earlier origins of the Ottoman Grand East, with the actually interest and with the growing presence of Britain and France, and later to some extent of Italy in the Ottoman lands, in the western part of the Ottoman Empire, such as Izmir, such as Istanbul, such as Salonika, for example. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ozan, for these interesting remarks and the interesting question. Yavuz, any?
Yes, of course, it's very important that the Ottoman Empire, the society meeting with Westernization ideas through the Crimean War. This is important because the social life will all change. The community has faced a different values, and of course, they had some effects on the Ottoman elites, bureaucrats, through the people from different ethnic origins, but carrying the Ottoman identity. It was important, but still, as far as the Freemasonry and the connection with Freemasonry concerned, we have to be careful. I think we have much more needing. We have to search much more and deeper into the connections about that, and it's not so obvious to me. Of course, there must be, but it needs to be explored. I agree, but I have to be a little bit more careful, Ozan. Thank you very much for your wonderful comment.
And there are questions coming from the chat. One question is from brother Mark Bucher, who says, can you elaborate about the links of the Ottoman Grand East with the ruling Ottoman family? If they were members, did they have responsibilities?
Well, you know, of course, there were princes, and even a sultan was a Freemason for a short time, but it's a famous story, but ending with a very dramatic story, dramatic end. There were princes who had, I think, good connections with European Western ideas, had enthusiastic beliefs about the growing side of empire and the revolution of Westernization. Everything was very important, I believe, and the connections were right. They became Freemasons, but not Freemason as we know. They didn't initiate in the lodges or something, but they had that courage to take that step towards the Freemasonry. And I believe it's interesting, It's also full of legends and rumors, so we have to be very careful about that also. And perhaps in the next years we will find much more publishing material, and we will talk about it better, I believe, later on. But now we have to be careful, and let's see what the accurate archive material will say to us. Until now, all we say is it was a symbolic approach to the Freemasonry by the sultans and princes.
Thanks, Yavuz. Another question is coming from Brother Anil Dinchsoy. Hi, Anil, who asks, how did the Ottoman Grand East affect international recognition of the Grand Lodge of Turkey in the future? What were the main points of relevance?
Well, this is quite a question.
Indeed, which contains
I'm not the
Masonic
person
politics.
that have the answers all the time, but I would like to think about it first, then answer later. All we can say is we have seen the oldest minutes of Grand Officers meeting. They have very good connections with other Grand Lodges. They have an idea of regularity. They like to take consultancy. They like to meet and take some other side's views. There are diplomats. They know the strategy, even in the Masonic diplomacy. And they had the connections. But Ottoman Grand East, as I said, is an Ottoman city. It's colorful, multi-religious, multilingual, everything is in there, but always sitting in the sharp edge of conflicts. So I think they took steps very carefully. And if they did something in purpose, they were being very careful. Because they maneuvered in the very stormy sea.
Thanks, Yavuz. Having spoken of international recognitions, there is a question from Brother Nazım Kadrizadeh. Well, I think directed to me. He says, question to Brother Sanver. He says, I think he said Turkish Freemasonry was not regular until the 1950s, 60s. Yes, I said that. And the Ottoman Grand Orient was not regular. I said that as well. Well, then how come AMI, Association Masonique Internationale, the International Masonic Association, was held in Istanbul with many foreign Grand Lodges visiting Turkey? Well, indeed, that association was a platform which was gathering Grand Lodge which were not in the world of regular Freemasonry. So it was a platform of, I would say, I don't like to say non-regular, but liberal Grand Lodges, which is very compatible with the fact that the meeting was held in Istanbul under being the host, being the Grand Lodge of Turkey. So there are two questions coming from Brother David Chichilnatse from Georgia, by the way, who is the organizer of the beautiful Sapere audio lectures, which I find a big contribution to the intellectual life of Freemasonry. Hi, David. So he asks two questions. One is that, could you elaborate on the nature of the community development initiatives, if any, brothers had during Ottoman Empire? He means non-Masonic community society at large. Would you take this, Yavuz? So what were the community development initiative of the Ottoman Masons, if any, during that time?
Well, it's a huge subject to talk about. I don't know where to start.
By the way, they were extremely political, this is clear.
There are many sides in this question. I mean, before 1919 or after 1919, before 1921, after 1921. It's, as far as the politics is concerned, it's a huge question. But I don't know where to start, where to end. I'm sorry.
Okay, so another question coming again from David, who says, were there any Masonic activities at all in the in its own words, the Arabic part of the empire? So probably the Muslim geography of the Middle East. If yes, could you elaborate about its nature, please?
Well, thank you very much for the question. This is not the subject that I'm specialized about. Of course, there were, and this is very important subject, and I'm not able to answer those questions. It's a whole big world.
That's the expertise of Thierry Zarcon, in fact.
Right.
If he would be here, he would tell us a lot of interesting stories on that. So there is another question which is coming from Attila Pök from Budapest. Hi, Attila. Did the Ottoman Grand East have a clear view on the persecution of the Armenians in 1915?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I would say that if for the era ending October 30, 1918, it has a different answer. After 1918, October 30, it has a different answer. And after May 15, 1919, this has a different answer. And in 1922, it has a different answer. So I'm starting as through the end of the government of the Union of Progress Party, they had a clear view about this, and all they were thinking about those accusations made by the Western countries that was unfair. And after 1918, October 30, a new approach is seen, as there were war criminals to be found and executed. This would make the Ottoman society and Freemasonry free and spotless. But after 1919, May 15, things changed again. So that's when we start to see the propaganda committee for the Ottoman Grand East and the declarations of Ottoman lodges to the Ottoman Grand East to stand up, uprise against those accusations, and a new approach has come, and standing a new wall, building a new wall, the powerful wall against the Western world, to stand and fight back. So through 1922, things seems a little bit changed and more diplomatic, and trying to find a way between, especially charity organizations, non-government NGOs being spread all over the country. A new approach has come to meet in the middle. So that's what I can say in short. I'm sorry, that's all.
And there is another question coming from Mark, who, in connection with the current question, asks, do you know whether Kirkor Zohrab, one of the most important leaders of the Armenian society, was member at the same lodge as the Jeune Turk leaders, We know from the history that Zohrab and Talat were friends before 1915. So I quoted his question. Do you have any answer to this, Yavuz?
Well, this is very important question that needs to be worked and studied with much more accurate archive material, like the lodge lists, matricule lists, and other things. Of course, I know Kiko Zorab, and I do have personal respect to him, but I don't know much information about that. We need much more accurate archive material to answer that question. But we have to be careful on those sensitive subjects to speak about, because it is mixed all with rumors and legends, and we have to take step by step, very carefully, those sensitive subjects
Thank you, Yavuz.
in the memory of those great men.
And I see again Shai, who is raising his hand, and we have a few more minutes. So yes, Shai, please unmute yourself.
Yes, I just wanted to answer someone that asked a question here about lodges in the Arab world, because as you know, I'm
You are
here
well placed
a
to answer
part
that.
of the, and my mother lodge is the oldest surviving lodge in Israel. It's from the Ottoman Empire. Is one of the consecrating lodges of the Grand Lodge of Turkey in 1909, the Aleppo Lodge. And so I can speak about this lodge that was actually started under the Memphis Misraim in 1891, Le Port du Temple du Salomon, afterwards 1906, Oro Barkai, under the constitution of, how should I say, Grand Royal de France, and under this constitution it precipitated in the inauguration of the Grand Lodge of Turkey, and 42 under the Grand National Lodge of Palestine back then, and 53 Grand Lodge of since 1953 Grand Lodge of Israel. So yes, there. This is a kind of an Ottoman, also Arab, because yes, not many Arabs were in this lodge, but many people from, well, yes, back then there was even at this lodge the mayor of Gaza. I know it's hard to imagine it today that the mayor of Gaza would come all the way to Jaffa with the political situation today. But yes, the mayor of Gaza and the mayor of Nablus were part of this lodge back then at the beginning of the 20th century. So this is a lodge that I hope that I contributed to the one who asked about lodges in the Arab world, because this is.
Thank you very much, dear Shai. I think there are no more raised hands or comments in the chat. So I will conclude the evening. Thank you very much once again for your participation. I truly believe that the arrival of Freemasonry to the Ottoman territory is a very interesting event, culturally and politically. Culturally, because it is one of the most important encounterings of Freemasonry with the Islamic culture. well, politically, because, well, the Ottoman Empire was a very important, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire was a very important political event. So there is a lot to dig in there. There is a lot to understand there. And today, Yavuz's presentation really inspired us to do further research in this direction. It was very enlightening as well. Thank you, Yavuz. And ladies and gentlemen, next month we are changing a continent and we will be moving to Latin America. It will be on the 24th of July, again a Saturday. And the speaker will be Jose Carlos de Seixas, who is the current Grand Secretary of Foreign Affairs of the Grand Lodge of Rio de Janeiro. And he will be talking us on history of Freemasonry in Latin America. So you will be most welcome again next month. Thank you very much for your participation, and I hope to see you soon. And good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.